how do people change their minds? And how does in-person conversation versus online conversation and information sharing and all that, how are those different in contributing to people changing their minds? So first, how do people change their minds? And I think the answer is generally slowly, on their own time, when they have a way of mulling things over, trying on different facts and different ways of seeing things, and when they've had time to integrate the mind change with the rest of their worldview, including with their emotional relationship with that worldview. That's generally how people change their minds. So let me go through 5 facts that I think are relevant to people changing their minds. And then I will connect this with what's the difference between the online space and the in-person space. So the first fact is that people do change their minds. I've changed my mind on quite a number of things. I know people whose views of things have evolved over time. And I think in some ways, people's minds being changed is happening more rapidly as social media speeds up and learns how to tap into people's emotional responses and their worldviews. So I think mind changing is happening and will continue to happen, especially given the online environment. The second thing is that people's minds change slowly, not in a single conversation. And one of the problems I think we're seeing a lot right now is that people will sit down for a Thanksgiving conversation with people with the hopes of changing that person's mind in the conversation that day. And what tends to happen if you approach it with that attitude is that the person gets farther entrenched in their position due to the competitive nature of that conversation. Because even if you don't tell them that you want them to change their minds, they are going to pick that up from you. And changing your mind slowly over time actually does make a lot of sense. Because a lot of times you need to think about things from different perspectives. You need to imagine, if I changed my mind about this, how would that change my view on this policy? How should I treat those people differently based on this mind change? And you kind of need to mull that over in different moods, putting that possible mind change in light of certain facts that you're aware of, certain experiences you have. You're going to need to really test that change of mind in different scenarios that are meaningful to you. And that just takes time for people. So this is why people's minds don't change immediately, they change slowly. Third fact, there is a balance between being too responsive to new information and not being responsive enough. So if you're not responsive enough, you're basically not updating your views in response to new facts. And the scientific community puts out new facts all the time. The scientific understanding of the world changes and evolves. So if you're not open to changing your worldview based on new information, then your understanding of the world will get left behind. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're not going to have a very accurate view of reality. So you do want to update your views. But if you change your views too readily, like any new fact, you're suddenly on the other side of the issue, or any new fact, you suddenly think about things too differently, then you're going to be vulnerable to manipulation. And this is particularly a problem in the world right now, where there are a lot of people out there trying to manipulate the way you think about the world. They have a stake in the game, and if they can convince you to their side, they can make more money, they will feel more respected, all of that kind of stuff. They will get more attention. So because there is so many people out there vying to change our minds, it's important not to be too vulnerable to those people manipulating you. The fourth fact here is that attention matters a lot for mind changing. And the best way of seeing this, I think, is to think about confirmation bias, where confirmation bias says basically that when you encounter information that fits inside your worldview, you pay a lot of attention to it. You read the study carefully, you make sure you know all of those facts that support your side, But when you encounter new information that supports a different worldview than yours, and especially if it's a worldview you're hostile to, you dismiss that pretty quickly. You come up with reasons not to pay much attention to it so that you don't have to look deeply into the study, so that you can say, oh, I don't believe those people. Oh, there's a flaw in the study. I don't need to think deeply about it. And so that's how confirmation bias works. It's where we pay a lot of attention to facts that support our view, and we dismiss facts that would disrupt our worldview, especially if that disruption would be highly emotional or would be something that has a lot of importance to our lives. But of course, that creates bias, right? Everybody's perspective is biased for this reason. This is actually why we need communities of people in the science world who think differently, because their biases can counterbalance each other. But the point I'm making here is that what matters for you to change your mind is that you actually need to pay attention to something for a while. You need to encounter new situations where you're thinking about that worldview without dismissing it, without dismissing the new information. And of course, if you're changing your mind, that probably means there is a body of evidence that should lead to that mind change. And you need the time to sort of think through each piece of that evidence carefully, where you're truly weighing the different complexities involved on any complex topic. So attention matters when it comes to mind changing. Now, the fifth fact here is that emotion matters for our understanding of the world and for our attention. And there's a couple of different ways that emotion matters. The first is that we need a worldview that we can live with emotionally. So sometimes the resistance people have to changing their mind, even when they should, is that changing their mind would have really emotional consequences for them. They might have to admit their mother-in-law was right. They might have to treat certain people in a different way. And if someone is considering a worldview change because they've looked at the evidence and they think the evidence might point in a different direction, that person also needs the time to sort of update their world emotionally so that they can emotionally handle the integration of the new viewpoint into their worldview. Like if people are starting to have some doubts about a view they have, but they need to really think more carefully about the entire body of evidence out there, that means they need to look at that new evidence, which might be emotional for them, looking at new facts that they had not yet considered. And people do this best when they get to decide when they're ready to look at that fact. Like, you know very well, in some moods, you're sort of in a highly agitated, threatened, anxious state. And that's not the best state of mind. It's not the best emotional state to encounter new information. Some days you're feeling more resilient and more courageous, and those actually are the best days to evaluate new evidence and to think about what would it look like if I did take on this new worldview? How would I incorporate all this new evidence? And they need the time to look at that body of evidence. All right, so how would we compare in-person conversations to online conversations when it comes to people changing their minds? Well, both of these spaces are going to have advantages and disadvantages. So for in-person conversations, one of the biggest advantages we have is that we know the person and we kind of know how they react. We can feel out their mood. Are they in a mood where they're open to new information, or are they in a defensive mood? Are they in a happy mood? So someone who is good at conversation can sort of tailor the conversation to that person in a way that's responsive to who they are. Now, I always advocate in any conversation between two people that it be on equal grounds. It can't be one person teaching the other. It needs to be two people who are both truly open to learning from the other person, and there needs to be equality in that relationship. So if you believe that you are definitely right, they have no points that could update your worldview, then I don't think that is likely to change anyone's mind, and I think it's actually a fairly unhealthy way of approaching relationship. The second advantage of in-person conversation is that In that space, you're able to introduce new information to a person that would not normally fit inside their social media news feed. Because of course we know a person's social media news feed is very carefully designed by the algorithms to achieve certain goals, such as engaging them, such as sucking them into the social media vortex. And so any information out there that is likely to be bad for that social media company's goals, that information will almost certainly never reach them. In the in-person space, you can actually encounter information that would be intentionally kept out of your social media feed. Now, most of the disadvantages of the in-person space when it comes to changing people's minds relate to human foibles. So it's naturally human to want to win an argument. Like even when you're having a conversation where you're both trying to learn from each other, humans have a competitive nature and we want the other person to come to our side. That's just so natural, you almost can't turn it off. And once you're in that competitive state, it's really easy for people to get further entrenched in a conversation than they were before the conversation began. I would say that's a natural state of things, is when people talk about it, they both end up farther on their side than when the conversation started. Another disadvantage is that humans don't understand each other very well. Like, we constantly make assumptions about how the other person thinks that are oftentimes false, oftentimes really not understanding their background, their emotional relationship with the topic. So even when we think we're tailoring an argument to that person, oftentimes we're not. Another disadvantage of in-person conversation is that we may have a distorted view about what works to get someone to change their mind. And this is particularly true in the age of social media. So if you're wrapped up in a social media vortex where two groups are going at each other online, you probably see a lot of content that is about people on your side slamming people on the other side. People on your side putting them in their place. Like, that's just sort of the tone and the nature of social media, because we love to consume content where our side demonstrates its moral and intellectual superiority. Like, that's just a human foible that we desire that. So because of that, you may have consumed content that makes it seem like, oh, when you deliver this one factoid slam to their side, those people cower and realize, oh, you are way more right than I am. Because the frame we like to consume is that frame where that factoid puts that group in their place. But there's a good chance that that factoid may actually do the opposite. Like, that factoid may be something that people on that side hear it from your side, and it comes across super illogical. They've come up with a bunch of reasons to dismiss it, and they think that anyone who uses that factoid slam is immoral and disrespectful and condescending. So that means when we come together for in-person conversation, we think some arguments will work against them that have the opposite effect that we could not have predicted. Okay, so what about the online space? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the online space for changing people's minds? One of the advantages of the online space is that people can take in new information at their own pace. Mind changing happens slowly, and it happens on the person's terms. So if someone is considering a mind change, they can choose to encounter new information at the right time. And the online space allows them full control over when they encounter new information, which generally fits in with mind changing. Another advantage the online space has is that these algorithms can actually tailor information toward people in a way that is matched to their emotional state, matched to their worldview. And of course, the algorithms don't know the person's emotions or worldview, but almost certainly these algorithms have really tapped into their motivational forces. And that means that most information that comes their way is very well tailored to the kinds of language that they respond well to and the frames that they respond well to, because the algorithms in some ways know without knowing how people respond. Now, I think the biggest disadvantage of the online space is that it doesn't have the actual love and care that comes from an in-person conversation. Like, human beings genuinely care about the relationships with each other, and if you can offer understanding and kindness while someone is exploring new viewpoints, that creates a safety in exploring those new viewpoints that the online space generally cannot offer. The online space also cannot tailor its message to people in a way that is truly human. And so it could be that you know a person really well and you know how they respond, and you have some intuitions about how to read their body language, how to read their facial expressions, that artificial intelligence, at least at the moment, cannot integrate into its message that it's sending someone. So that's just a few thoughts on how people change their mind and how it relates to the in-person versus the online space.